Hey there! Thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, where I review all the fan-created, canonized Bionicle models. These are not official sets, but instead have been officially accepted into the G1 Bionicle storyline, either via LEGO-sanctioned contests like the 05 Dark Hunter and Rahi contest, or the more modern ongoing TTV canonization contests, which are currently overseen by Greg Farsty himself. Today's model is from the Dark Hunter contest from 05. This is Kraata-Kal. Kraata-Kal's backstory is pretty interesting. It's a little bit of a unique backstory compared to the rest of the Dark Hunters. Essentially, he is the result of an experiment. The Shadowed One took a Kraata, which were the slugs housed inside rock-sheet compartments, and exposed it to the same protodermic process which is used to transform Krana into Kraata-Kal for the Borog. The result was a highly intelligent Kraata, which later on the Shadowed One built a suit of armor for, and thus resulted in what you see here, Kraata-Kal. However, the intelligence of this being was sometimes a little bit too high even for the Shadowed One to handle, and he often had his own will and would disobey direct orders in order to pursue profit for himself. As a result, the Shadowed One often instructed Vezok to remind him how easily armor can be shattered if you know where to hit it. So basically, he was very willful, continually tried to betray the Dark Hunters or go out for his own profit, so definitely not a member that was very trusted, but he was very useful and very formidable, which is why the Shadowed One kept him around. He was also eventually part of the team that was sent to investigate the Paraka's disappearance, but unfortunately they didn't find anything. But story aside, let's just talk about the 4 key points in which I'll be reviewing this model, the first of which is posability. So can I get this into good poses without it falling over? Can it support the weight of its own weapons? And generally, are there stability issues, or can I just pose this well without having to worry about stability? Number 2 is building techniques. So does this just recycle stuff from the existing sets, or does it actually try to do something new, and was I impressed with any of the building techniques used for this model? Number 3 is general aesthetics. So how good does this look agnostic of the story? Does this look like a formidable warrior? Does it look like someone I would not want to cross in a battle? And finally, number 4 is story relevance and how it makes sense in the story. So essentially, does this match the backstory of a mutated Kraata turned into a Kraata-Kal and later on having a suit of armor built for it? Does this scale nicely next to other characters, like the Shadowed One or maybe other Toa or Dark Hunters, or even compared against some Rockshi? And just in general, does this feel believable as a part of the Bionicle universe? Let's dive into all of that and more as we take a look at the Dark Hunter Kraata-Kal.
Alright, so here's the close-up of the Dark Hunter Kraata-Kal. Let's take a look at exactly how this works posability-wise. So starting off with the legs, I just want to point something out. You may immediately notice that I am relying on the tail to actually let him stand up. Without that tail touching the ground, good luck getting this guy to stand, because quite frankly, it just won't, unless you're really patient and really creative about how you pose him. However, with the tail on the ground, he actually can stand up okay. So I guess that's a bit of a con, but at least he can stand up at all, rather than some other models who don't even have a tail to allow them to stand up more stably. So at the moment, I'll just leave the tail on the ground, but I just wanted to point out that yes, it really is only standing because that tail is touching the ground. And you'll probably notice why as soon as we get into leg articulation. So moving this arm out of the way first, I want to just show off exactly how the legs work. Now, just a note, these are supposed to be in dark gray. They are not supposed to be in metal blue. I really just only had the metal blue pieces on hand while I was building this, so hopefully you can kind of ignore that coloration. And just note for the actual model, these are supposed to be dark gray. But moving on to the posability, you'll notice he can move his leg back and forth, but not back. That's a big problem with the stability of this model because really, as you can see, he can't actually bend his legs past this point because of the way it's mounted. It also means his legs are mounted really far forwards, which also isn't a great position to have, especially because this is just so back heavy. And there's so much stuff going on behind this model, which can cause it to topple over. Of course, these are just basically standard Rockshi limbs, if you ignore that piece just falling off right there. So of course these are just standard Rakshi limbs. You can basically see the way that it's built from the leg down. It's just a regular Rakshi type build. It's a little wobbly because the specific axle chosen to build this was one of the shorter length axles, which isn't really that good in my opinion. They probably could have used a longer axle for this. But if you get past the wobbliness, it basically just functions as a standard Rakshi leg. You have all the knee articulation you would want. The feet are also mounted on just reverse Mata feet with claws sticking out of the front. Nothing too crazy to see here in terms of posability beyond what you would expect. Unfortunately, this does mean that for such a build that's very top heavy and has a very bulky and complex torso in the front, it again makes it very hard for this model to stand without feeling a little bit awkward, and you kind of have to have him tilted forward significantly because of it. Before we move on to the rest of the articulation, I will note that it does have these little claw pieces that are just masking the open ball joints on the front of the legs here. These really don't do anything other than just kind of sit there, and I guess they've been added on for aesthetics. Honestly, to me personally, they look a little bit awkward just in the way that they've been positioned. They really stick out quite far, and it does feel a little bit strange how they are sticking out like that. But it's something I can kind of overlook because it does actually cover up the exposed ball joint. Moving on to the top here, we have some sort of a claw-like appendage that wraps around the torso. Doesn't really do anything in terms of articulation, and I'm not really sure if it's supposed to. I don't really see these as extra arms or stingers. It just almost feels like these are part of the body, almost like how Brutaka has his back blades. Thankfully, you can move the head around on a standard ball joint, so you do have pretty much the amount of head articulation that you would expect. He can't quite look up all that well because there is the piece that's mounted up here to give the glow to the Rakshi's eyes that's kind of blocking the articulation there. And if you try to articulate it too much, well, it just kind of falls apart like that, but it kind of gets the point across, and you can see that this is really all the articulation you'll probably need. Moving on to the arms themselves, the arms are mounted on ball joints, but they are mounted a little bit in a strange manner. If I remove this arm here, you'll notice that they've actually taken the standard Mata limb piece, mounted it onto the Mata hand, and kind of added on a ball joint at the end to have some sort of articulation on the other side of this normally fixed handpiece. It works out okay, but it does kind of feel a little bit awkward, especially if you want to splay the arms out. If you notice, I'm going to move this a little closer to the camera here, but splaying it out can cause the arm to pull out of the socket here, even just by a little bit. That socket immediately begins to start to pop out, so it's not the best configuration, especially with the way the arm is mounted. Moving on to the back here, you'll also notice the second issue with this is that it makes the arms really easy to fall off, especially because they're just mounted on the older type of ball joint. The arms themselves are pretty fixed. You've got a standard hand on each arm with a bottom claw mounted by a click hinge, which is pretty interesting. It's not often that you see click hinges incorporated into Bionicle mocks, but you can see right here, it works out just quite well. It has a very similar situation on the other hand, which is good for consistency, although on this hand you can also see that a claw piece has been mounted on a ball joint here to complete the full hand on this side because of course he's just using some sort of a wrist-mounted launcher on this hand versus having his entire hand on this side be completely engulfed in some sort of a fire blaster or even some sort of a sword that he can use here. And that's not all in terms of articulation, because you may notice it also has some back wings. Now these wings are particularly flimsy because they're just mounted on standard ball joints, but they get the job done. You can kind of fold them back, move them outwards, and it does look pretty realistic. What I also like is that by moving around certain aspects of the wings, you can cause the back parts to articulate a certain way. Just because of the way these have been actually mounted on a Technic beam here, it's a very simple connection, but bending this down can cause the other one to bend down as well, which means you have a closed position like so, and an open position like this, which works out really well if it doesn't separate like it just did right there. The same, of course, can be said for the other wing. You move it down, you move it up, it's a pretty nice but satisfying function that makes it actually look like it's in flight and can have an open and close articulation for the back of the wing here. Of course, one other thing, the final thing to articulate here is the tail. You can articulate this pretty much completely alongside this ball joint, although it does make it so that it pops out really easily, like you can see right here, just keeps on popping out because the Rakshi socket is not designed to support this much weight. You also have some sort of an articulation here with a frankly over-engineered bit of Technic right here for the tail, as well as the limbs and the back stinger tail here, which looks adequate for my opinion. It's nothing too nice, it's not bad either. Honestly, the worst thing I can say about it is that this does not have any friction to it, so it's really easy to just be not able to pose the stinger tail because of the way that it's mounted. You kind of have to squeeze together these two hand pieces to actually get it to stay in a fixed position like this, which obviously is not the best of building techniques. But it also does allow you to have some sort of a fun stinging articulation by just kind of whipping it around the front of his head like so. So I guess in a way, the lack of friction actually makes this a more fun play feature. But with that, we've basically taken a look at all of the different posability aspects of this creature. Obviously, as you can see, it's a little cluttered, and it does feel very chaotic to me, which is both good and bad. You've got a lot of things going on that you can move around, but at the same time, that means that it's really difficult to pose because you've got the wings just flopping around, the tail flopping around, the two legs barely staying in position unless you mount them at a very awkward angle, kind of like they are right now, and the fact that it of course cannot stand without the weight of this stinger tail just resting on the back here. All in all, I think it's a pretty awkward build posability-wise, although you can actually get it into some cool poses as long as you pay attention to exactly which parts of the body move and just angle everything perfectly right. The one biggest con to me in terms of posability is that I can't actually splay the upper legs outwards from just the fixed, straight, vertical position. It's really frustrating because sure, I can kind of bend it like this and then maybe I can splay it like so, but that kind of gives you a very strange angle to mount this with, and honestly, I am not the biggest fan of these click hinges in particular because they really do restrict articulation. If they were a knee joint, that's fine. For anything else, it kind of feels awkward, especially because you can't actually splay it out and have any meaningful articulation at the same time. If you want him to be standing up straight, well, you can't really bend these outwards anymore, so that's a big con to me. The other thing is that these wings are way too heavy for their own good, and they do tend to just fall backwards, especially if your joints are weak. I probably would prefer at least some sort of other connection to hold the wings on, especially because they are an integral part of the model, and having just one of these wings accidentally fall backwards can really throw off a lot of the work that's been put into posability. But while we're on the topic of how this all comes together, I just want to mention a few things in terms of building techniques. For the most part, I'm generally pretty happy with how the upper part of this body went. Sure, it does have quite a lot of things going on, but you can at least see how well things go together. Of course, the one thing I don't like is just how easy it is to have these limbs just pop off, especially if you articulate them a certain way. It's really frustrating because there were a lot of different ways they could have mounted the limbs, but the builder went with the way that such that if you want to move the arm outwards, it actually pulls the arm out of its socket, which really isn't that great to me. The other thing is that the wings, while fun, do look a little bit awkward with just this very clear Technic beam sitting right here. And of course, as we move on to the tail, it does feel like it is really, really large and just extends out at a very strange place of the body. You would think a tail would extend from here, not have it be arcing down from the back. And speaking of this back position, I am not a fan of exactly how these legs are mounted. I feel like there were a lot of different ways you could have mounted these legs to make it a lot more stable, but instead the builder went with this very awkward 90-degree angle of click hinges, which really throw off all of the posability and articulation of this build, in addition to making it aesthetically look very awkward as you move it around. Unless you're looking at this from the perfect angle or just front on, you'll immediately notice that the legs are mounted way too forwards than they should be, and that to me is a major con. But then moving on to aesthetics, because we've already started going into that a little bit, I do like the weapon choices to an extent. I think having a wrist-mounted launcher here does make sense and does work well as some sort of a bladed launcher weapon here also looks perfectly fine. What I do not like, however, is exactly how all of this comes together. The color scheme just feels a little bit too jumbled and chaotic for me to really appreciate it for what it is. You've got the reds, grays, blacks, silvers, dark grays, light grays, all of it kind of comes together and it doesn't feel like there's any visual cohesion to this build. Especially with the fact that you've got some red pieces sticking out here, not really sure what these are supposed to be, and just some kind of bits of color patches scattered throughout. I really do feel like there was a lot more work that could have been done to make this color scheme a lot better in my opinion. It is, however, not without its pros. The one benefit to having this arguably random distribution of pieces of red all throughout the body make it such that it almost looks like this was a black and silver colored creature, but these are maybe spurts of fire that are bursting out of it. It means it's an unstable creature. I don't know, whatever you want to call it to excuse the fact that it has this random red sticking out in different colors of places, particularly the transparent red. I can kind of see how this could work in universe, especially given that the intentional choice was made to include some transparent red jaws underneath the head here. Other than that, though, it's really not that great in terms of aesthetics for me personally, and the really big thing that also hurts it is the fact that I can't get around how awkward the front legs look, and the way these are mounted make it very awkward to play with. You just can't splay these out, and any attempt to splay these out just makes it look like he's almost splaying his legs out in an incorrect way or in some sort of a V-shaped way like this. Doesn't look all too menacing, almost looks like he just needs to go to the restroom. But now I think it's a good time to zoom out from this model in particular and compare him to some representative samples in the Bionicle universe as we wrap up this review. Let's do that right now.
Alright, so zooming out, let's take a look at the Dark Hunter Kraata-Kal alongside some other Rakshi right here, and the Doom Viper, which is an animal that resembles a Rakshi. So immediately you can see that the scale of the Kraata-Kal is a little bit taller than the standard Rakshi build, although not honestly by much. One thing that it does have in common with many of these other Rakshi is just how close the lower legs are together, which is both a pro and a con, because of course it kind of makes sense for these proportions, but when you look at these proportions, it really doesn't make too much sense. So I guess props for accuracy because you did work in the Rakshi upper and lower limbs here, but on the other hand, the legs could most likely have been spread out just a little bit more, and the build would definitely have been the better for it. Of course, none of these Rakshi have any sort of tail, but it does make sense because this is a mutated Rakshi, and of course they don't have wings either, but the wings do seem like they fit perfectly on this build. The one thing that maybe I would have liked to see was some sort of a staff weapon, especially because the Rakshi are so often associated with those weapons, as you can see right here, but I think they reached a bit of a compromise with the long-bladed tip of the fire sword sticking out right here, and then you've just got some sort of a launcher on the other hand, which of course Rakshi don't normally have, but I guess it could make sense for this build in particular. But setting aside all of these builds, let's just take a look at how this appears just by itself and start ranking it alongside the main points. So starting off with the point of posability, obviously as I complained in my review, the only reason why it's standing right now is because the tail's touching the ground. Lift it up and you're gonna have a bad time with the posability. The other thing is that the wings can kind of flop back very easily. Just tilting the model backwards causes the wings to just flop around all sorts of places, and just picking it up to move it around can really cause things to get out of sorts. You really do have to fiddle with it quite a lot and do a lot of work just to get it in a semblance of a standing position without it continually just falling over and over again, which is pretty unfortunate. That being said, as I mentioned at the beginning of the review, it's better than many other Dark Hunters who have the same problem but don't have the added benefit of having a tail in the back to support its weight, no matter how awkward or strange looking the tail may look, which in this case, it does look pretty strange. Of course, the other thing is that when you move around the arms, just by moving it upwards like this can cause them to pop out of their socket, and really there's only a few very minor saving graces of this model in terms of posability. These include the fact that, well, you can actually get this into pretty cool poses. I spent a fair bit of time getting it into a cool pose on the thumbnail of this video, which you can see behind me right here, and it does go to show that you can actually get this to look decently good if you manage to spend a lot of time to pose it and really make it look good on your shelf. It's not like some of the other Dark Hunters where no matter what you do, it can't just get in a pose well. This one, I'd say you just have to work at it, and you can actually get it to look pretty cool and menacing. However, again, you really gotta work at it, and the legs and arms are not doing it any favors. So posability-wise, this is going to get a 6 out of 10. It's a little better than the average Dark Hunter, but not by much, and you gotta work at it to get it into a good pose. Moving on to number 2, let's take a look at building techniques. I'm generally pretty happy with how the torso is built, at least the upper part, And the wings, despite having some awkward parts placement, do work out pretty well and have the added bonus of having actually a really fun and satisfying wing flapping or closing feature. What I don't like, however, were the parts used to build the sides of the arm connectors. I do feel like there could have been major improvements made to make the arms actually be able to move up and down, as well as the choice of the click hinges here, which to be honest throw off the entire model for me just by how awkward they look, how hard it makes it to pose, and in general just how strangely placed they are to jut so far out of the torso. If you look at the side here, the placement of the tail is also placed very awkwardly to me, and it does also feel very heavy and parts intensive for what it is, which essentially could have been just achieved by just a few standard socket parts. The amount of parts that goes into this tail also means that it's really hard to actually make this tail stay up in one position just because of how heavy it is. So all in all, I think I'm going to give building techniques a 6 out of 10. There were a lot of really cool ideas in this build, such as having the wings be sprouting out of the back, having some sort of an action feature built into the stinger tail here, and even having some sort of a cool weapons choice and some click hinges for the claws. But all in all, I think honestly this is a case of just having too many ways to pose it, and there's just too many things that can become loose and go wrong in the way that it's posed. So that's one of the major cons for me, but then we can move on to aesthetics. So going back to the earlier parts of the review, I did mention that aesthetics are pretty mixed to me personally, especially because of how chaotic it looks and all the different colors scattered throughout the build and whatnot. It really does feel like a lot more could have been done in terms of aesthetics to make this feel like a lot more of a cohesive build. That being said, there are some aspects that I feel like maybe you can explain with your imagination, such as, for example, having the transparent red accents be bits of fire that are shooting out of it, or some sort of a molten unstable core because this was an unstable mutation of a Kraata and a Krana. So maybe you can excuse some aspects of it like that. That being said, it just feels a little bit awkward overall. I'm going to stop touching him for this part of the review because otherwise I'm not going to be able to say anything while this guy keeps on falling over. So we're just going to have him stay right here, and there goes his weapon. You know what? I'm going to hold him in my hand. So color-wise, it's pretty mixed. Again, the color blocking could have been really improved here, but again, this could have been explained a little bit with the story. So all in all, I think I'm going to give aesthetics a 6 out of 10, much like the other points. There are some ways where you can get it into cool poses and make it actually look legitimately cool and menacing. But those are really honestly hard to do, and you really kind of have to hide the backside or really any side angles to make it look cool. If you look at it from the side, it immediately looks very strange, especially because the feet are mounted so far forwards. The tail is mounted at a very strange high angle and also just doesn't stay in place. And even the wings have these awkward Technic beams holding it in place that really don't make it feel very cohesive as a model. All in all, this did have a lot of promise to it and honestly looked pretty cool in the official image, but when I actually have it in hand, I was a little disappointed at how incoherent this model is. And then we can finally move on to believability in universe. And that's the one point where I think this does a fairly decent job. I can clearly see by the parts usages that this was supposed to be a Rakshi but just mutated. And you can see that right here by these same pieces for the legs being used, the same Rakshi head, you've even got the Rakshi spine in the back, sort of, and even the tail almost looks like it was some sort of an elongated Kraata, especially with the spike at the end almost looking like the curved back piece of a Kraata, as well as this whole curved section making it look like just a massive Kraata in an exosuit. The wings, while they might be a little bit out of place on a Rakshi, maybe could be excused and make sense because of the fact that some Rakshi can actually fly, as we saw in the Mask of Light, so I guess that kind of works. And all in all, I think the only thing that this one was really missing was some sort of a staff-like weapon to really sell me on the fact that this is just like another Rakshi. That being said, that's not that big of a deal for me, so all in all, believability in universe is getting an 8 out of 10 for me. There are some things that it does which do feel a little bit strange and out of place, like a Rakshi wielding a projectile weapon, although again, this isn't just a regular Rakshi, this is a mutated combination between a Kraata and a Krana, so I can kind of excuse it that way. I do actually like how this tail looks like a large-scale Kraata, so all in all, I think believability in universe generally works. But with that, we've summed up my look at this Dark Hunter Kraata-Kal. If you've built this or are planning on building it, let me know down in the comments below what do you think of this model, and stay tuned to Duckbricks for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Stay tuned every week, every Monday for a brand new Bionicle Fanon review. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'll talk to you again very soon.